Welcome to Life Science Marketing Radio, the podcast where marketing leaders inside and outside the sciences share their creative ideas and practical approaches to increasing your marketing ROI. Here's your host, Chris Connor.
Chris Morrison is the founder of Via Veris, specializing in launching disruptive technology. That's our topic today. And Brian Jameson is the CEO and founder of Diagnostic Biochips, which you might guess, or will soon see, has a disruptive technology. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk about disruption today and a sales framework for those disruptive products. In other words, how do we figure out how to sell something that is completely new and might struggle with adoption because no one knows what to compare it to? But first, I want to learn about this technology that you have, Brian. Tell us about neuronal probes at a basic level, just to get us all up there. And then I'm going to ask you about how you're using them differently.
Sure. So the basic question that we set about answering more than 10 years ago, and actually I've been in the field for even longer than that as a grad student and commercially and through research institutes, is how does the brain get wired together to form a useful circuit? And so it may sound like a funny question, but it's really fundamental to who we are. And I think it's much more on people's sort of radar screen these days because of artificial intelligence, that networks themselves are processing units. And in fact, that's the processing unit of our brain. It's not a neuron that does computation. It's trillions of neurons strung together into a network. And as fundamental as that is, the amazing thing is we really don't know how it works. So that's a pretty sobering fact if you think about how simple the network models that comprise AI are. You know, the AI models that are successful in doing the amazing things that ChatGPT does are really still simple topographically compared to your brain. So to cut to the chase, we are providing tools that let researchers tease out how those networks function. And we really peer down into I hate to take the digital analogy too far, but we peer down into the ones and zeros that make up your brain. You know, if you remember back to the Matrix, like, we're looking at the pure matrix of your brain, and we provide tools that do that.
All right, so I'm going to ask, because neurobiology and immunology are probably at the bottom of my knowledge list on the biology scale. So what signals are you looking at? Like, if you put a neuronal probe into an animal's brain, what are you looking at? And then, because we're going to talk about testing organoids or single neurons, what information do you get when it's not connected to something else?
So we get information about the sequence and the timing of what's called action potentials. So this is the electrical output of single neurons. And again, what we're doing, we're not looking at those, and it literally is almost a 1 and a 0. A neuron is either firing or it's not firing. And that conveys information to other neurons in the network. So we are able to tap into a section of that network and record all those 1s and 0s from single neurons. But
and then
multiple,
you extrapolate
multiple
something
at a
out
time. Yep.
About the timing of that, or what makes it do that.
We measure it. Yeah, we measure the sequence. So if you think about, you know, it's really a pretty good analogy. You think about putting a network analyzer on the Ethernet connection in your office. What are you going to see? You're going to see a sequence of 1s and 0s, you know, from different lines in that network. We're seeing a sequence of action potentials from different cells in that network.
Okay. All right. So, Chris, let's start with your framework. What do disruptive products like the one Brian's team is working on require, or why do they require a totally different approach to sales and marketing than something that's a more incremental technology?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I love working with companies like Brian because, I mean, this, you know, very nascent technologies that are trying to figure their way of how they're going to be used by the, you know, by, in Brian's case, the end users, the scientists, and then how they're going to be used by the industry and the market at a broader scale. I love, this is the stage I love working with companies. But So the question is, why do they need a different sales framework for disruptive technology like what Brian's doing versus incremental product or product, or a standard product that's already being on the market, existing product? And the most fundamental reason for this, Chris, is that when you have an established product or an incremental product, you have history, you have data that you can build a sales model around. So so you can actually build a sales model and effectively and anticipate it that's going to work. So a go-to-market plan for if it was an incremental product that Brian was bringing to the market, he could build a sales plan, 6 months, a year before he goes to launch, build that out, build out the model, build out the marketing plan, build out the sales team, build out the revenue model around. They have a pretty good idea that it's going to play out the way it's planned. With a product like Brian's doing, the Disruptive is none of that's no one's ever done what Brian has ever done before. No one. So, the customers are trying to figure out how to use the technology. At the same time, Brian as a company is trying to figure out how to deliver that technology from a functional standpoint, but also how do they sell into that market. So the fundamental basic is, instead of an execution-based sales model, which is what every sales model out there is, you've got to build a discovery-based sales model, discovering the sales process, not executing a sales process that you have a pretty good certainty of how it's going to play out.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like, you're solving a problem that people haven't even thought about in a way, right? Because it's not incremental. It's like, now we could do this. What would we do with it? And you're figuring out how to communicate that in some way. Like, what would you do if you could do this?
An analogy you could think is you're trying to build a plane while you're flying it, right? And that is actually the case. And in Brian's case, we're starting to build he's going to market with this product for the first time, and that's what we're working on. And we're trying to figure out just how to go to market for the first time. But as he develops and the technology matures and the market matures, he'll be reiterating the discovery of how to do the next use case of this technology in the market. You and I come back from the early days of genomics, and I was doing this back in early 2000s when we were and where genomics was then and what we were building as a sales model for them, which we were discovering back then, completely different than the sales model that people have around genomics today. So yes, Brian will continue to do it, but we're trying to do it for the very first time for this product, which is we're discovering it and we're figuring that out now.
Let me see if I can make it more relatable. I'm guessing about what genomics was like in the early 2000s a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, yes, we could have a sequence of all these things, but people maybe didn't realize the workflows that were going to be required to handle all that data, and then what they might use it and how they might interpret it and all those things. So
it's a good analogy. So think about it. CRISPR wasn't invented yet, right? So maybe some real visionaries thought about gene editing and how that was someday going to be possible, but we didn't even know in the really early days. We didn't even know how to sequence genes, right? And what the specific sequences were, much less being able to edit them. So yeah, it's a good analogy in terms of the workflows, the volume of data, as you said, but also the sort of broad scope of potential impact, and how do we drill down on first applications and first impacts.
Right. So, Brian, tell us about making the switch from a research tool to a high throughput testing solution. So I'm interpreting from that, like, neuronal probes of some sort have existed, but now you're going to be testing multiple organoids, neurons at scale. What does that look like, and what have you learned about?
So we've learned a ton from the sales perspective. We've learned, and with Chris's help going out into the market and really doing market exploration, we've learned a lot about what people need and want. From a fundamental point of view, it's been really amazing just to see the technology, which we can take no credit for, of organoids, these programmable stem cell cultures. And for us, it was right place at the right time, because our scaling problems as you said, were really centered around the fact that we were just selling sensors, and the sensors were inherently, very extensive, work extensive. So you had to do a surgery in an animal model for each sensor, and all of a sudden, this organoid tool sort of started really becoming prevalent and useful and powerful, and it just opened up the door for us for scaling and for taking this from a strictly basic science research to a translational tool. So to give an example, how do drugs and therapies impact that circuit function that I described at the outset of the interview?
That might have answered my next question, in that I'm imagining like a 96 well plate with an organoid in each one, under which you're going to put different doses or different drugs all together and see how does that sequence of ones and zeros that you described change. Is that
bingo? You got it. So the way I sometimes describe it to people, it's thinking of brain networks as a druggable target. So, usually when you think about druggable targets, you're thinking about a receptor, an ion channel receptor, the like. And people don't usually talk about networks as druggable targets. That's really the tool that we're developing here is letting you do that. So 3 examples, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, and epilepsy. Clearly, these are malfunctions of network properties, and yet the tools out there currently for looking at therapies and how it impacts those malfunctioning networks, as a target, just not available. So we're looking to change that.
okay? That's cool. Yeah, I didn't know either of those facts about the whole network thing. But so now we're not looking at specific receptors, for example. We're looking at systems a little
Yep.
bit.
So I wouldn't, I have to be careful. We're not replacing that kind of, detailed low level science. We're just sort of
Right.
bridging this gap in between, patch clamping and receptor binding studies all the way up to like behavior, which has been the next stop. The train's next stop was behavior. People would look at these animal models and behavior. Oh, did our drug that we know binds to this relevant receptor, does it have an impact on animal behavior? That's a crazy step. It's way too big of a step to take, functionally. So we're providing a functional assay that really looks at things much closer to the source of the drug action at the network level.
That's exciting. Okay, so you're placing systems now with translational groups like Scripps and Stanford. What have those conversations taught you about not only your product, but your messaging and your business model?
So I'm sure Chris wants to answer this too, but from my perspective as a technology developer, I've been amazed actually at how little pushback we've gotten on some of our base contentions about inadequacies in the marketplace. So, we do have some sort of competitive legacy systems out there that are not doing the job, different technologies from ours. And I thought, because people tend to cling very tightly to what they have and they know, I thought we were going to be having a lot of conversations where we had to sort of badmouth or ghost, to put a name on it, technologies like MEA, microelectrode array technologies, and calcium imaging. In fact, we found that people really do very quickly want to move past that. Again, not a case where those technologies are useless, but a case where there's much more to be discovered scientifically, and we're sort of moving into that frontier. So I've been very surprised how eager people are to sort of embrace this new technology. When I say people, Chris will tell you now, over to Chris, but he will tell you there's a certain kind of person, very, very early adopters, which is what we're focusing on.
Yeah. So what does that sound like or look like, Chris?
So Brian's getting very focused in on what we're doing today, and with diagnostic biochips and where we're focused on right now. When I start with Brian, I go back out to the bigger picture when I'm looking at this, and what I'm looking for is what I know for Brian for disruptive technology like this. It's so disruptive. It's disruptive on, from a scientific and a technical standpoint. Brian's allowing scientists to do things they've never been able to do before. But when I step out and look at Chris, is that I know for Brian, to be successful, he's got to figure out a repeatable sales process for a problem that the market has today to establish his company in the marketplace today and to raise enough money to be able to grow as the market kind of finds how to use this technology that hasn't been available up till now. So that's kind of what I come out to is I try to figure out where Brian is and where his company is in developing a repeatable sales process. And because of the nature of technology, it's very early on. We're looking simply at the very front end of the repeatable sales process, which is who's the user, what's the use case, and what's the problem we're solving. And Brian started alluding to that. That's what we're trying to tease out now is, who's the user? It's an early adopter, but where is the early adopter? When Brian brought me on, when we started working together a little over a year ago now, he had one big, top 5 pharma company that they were working with really nice deal. But we thought that was the place where we were going to push into the marketplace earlier on. When we started doing the customer discovery there, we really couldn't get the attraction. We have one really probably a visionary that he had tapped into that wanted to start pulling the technology towards them and figure out how to do it. But we couldn't find that repeatable in the pharma space. So we then started growing the market to where that market entry point is going to be. And we kind of found this middle space where we're calling translational drug development between the academic labs and big pharma. There's these translation organizations. You mentioned one, Chris Scripps, so, that are in that space. There are a lot of .orgs that are in that space. But we're looking at right now, we're trying to figure out, and we're kind of figuring out where we're going to enter the marketplaces. We're starting to figure out the problems, which Brian alluded to a minute ago, around his surprise that the market recognizes there a problem, but they don't know how to solve that problem or don't even know what solution they're looking for. So now we kind of figure out where we think our market entry point is in the marketplace. Now we're trying to figure out what the messaging is to get their attention. What's the specific use cases around the technology that they can use to solve a problem they have today. What that problem they have today, Chris, is going to be very different than the problem they have 18 months from now and the problem they have 5 years from now. And that's kind of for a company like Brian, you and I talked about this previously, Chris, is we're trying to figure out where do you enter the market and create a repeatable sales process so Brian can get a reliable revenue stream that, first of all, he can get revenue from and start building a company around, but also go out to investors and say, listen, we've got this repeatable model. We can build this revenue stream. We can raise money around it, but also to let him start positioning diagnostic biochips so as the market starts adopting and figuring out how to use this type of technology, he's kind of keyed up to be at that inflection point when we hit when the market takes off. Brian's right there keyed up to take advantage of it and is a leader in the field. Now I just talked about a whole bunch of things, but again, what we're working on right now with diagnostics is just the very front end of that repeatable sales process we're trying to figure out right now. And I'll probably flip this back to Brian, but we're targeting a big conference in the fall as the launch of the product. So we're figuring out how to kind of figure out our messaging so that we can get leverage the most we can out of that conference and really start getting Brian and the company in a repeatable sales process around early adopters in this particular space.
Right. So what jumps out to me there, two things, going back to front, the repeatable sales process so that you can generate revenue along the way to keep going. And the first thing that jumped out at me, tell me if this is true, like you find one big pharma client and you think, oh, we found our market. And it turns out, no. And you could have wasted a lot of time going around without looking elsewhere to go, oh, that person got it, but that isn't the ideal use case. Yes. There are others sort of in the intermediate space between academia and pharma.
So you just gave me the chills a little bit, Chris, because this is a problem we see happening all the time. And I've actually coined a term. I call it the innovation death spiral, where we have a startup company. They get a little signal from the marketplace. They think they found their market, and then they launch a company around that. And then what ends up happening is they get a little bit of early success, and then all of a sudden it flattens out and it drops off. And you got to be very sensitive to that because that happens. I mean, that's a very common story in the innovation death spiral. And then they start doubling down with that plan. And this is where, and they keep doubling down and they put more money and still have the same outcome, which is not the revenue results they need. This is the challenge, this is the real challenge of shifting from that execution mindset. We have something to work. Let's build a plan. Let's execute. No matter what, we're going to keep executing until we just kill ourselves. Versus a discovery mindset. And this is what we did with Brian. Okay, Brian, here's our hypothesis. We think big pharma is a place to go. Okay, how do we test and validate or invalidate that as quickly as possible? That's kind of one of the fundamental principles you operate around. And then another one is the one we start talking about, the repeatable sales process, Chris, is that for any sales team to execute effectively, they have to have a repeatable sales process. By definition, at the launch of disruptive technology, you do not. You have to discover that repeatable sales process. So those are two fundamental things. And to get the scale in sales, you have to have a repeatable sales process. And in Brian's case, to get funding to build a company effectively, you have to have something that's a repeatable market model to execute against.
I'm going to go back to Brian here in a second, but it occurs to me, I heard something, this was on David Letterman probably 30 years ago. I think it was Oral Hershiser who said this. He said, if you've got one pitch, you've got no pitches. If you have two pitches, you have two pitches, right?
Yes, right.
So by that, I mean, you got to find a couple people to start a repeatable sales process. If you have one, you have no idea if that's the one or not.
Yep, that's exactly true. And yeah, and you got to be careful. You probably have to get to, in the case of Brian's company, which is a pretty significant B2B complex sale, you're probably not going to start teasing out the repeatable sales process until we probably get somewhere between 10 and 20 customers. Yeah. Might seeing enough data to start having a repeatable sale process. So you got to have enough evidence to build it out. So yeah, there's kind of some broad things, numbers you have to hit before you get there. But 1, 2, 3, no, you don't have it. And then the other thing that I often happen to see companies is they shoot all over the place. We've got one pharma client, we've got one academic client, we've got one of this, in some different space. Okay, now we're ready to ramp up our sales team and sell. I mean, that's like the complete definition of no repeatability and premature scaling of everything that's just going to kill you.
Yeah. For all the kids listening, Oral Hershiser was a pitcher for the Dodgers back in the 80s. All right, Brian. What's it like building a company in a space,
right, Chris?
Where the science is still emerging, even the experts aren't quite sure what to do with the data you can generate? What's it like talking to these folks?
I love being here. I mean, I love science myself. I'm trained as an engineer, not a scientist, but I've always aligned myself, as an engineer right next to scientists and cutting edge scientists. So in addition to working in this field, which I started back in my grad school days, I did a stint with NASA for about 6 years and developed analytical instrumentation for spaceflight missions. Same thing. You had guys that were like, and women that were, rubbing their hands, like wanting new and unseen data before. And as an engineer, your job is to provide novel tools that uncover, new answers to old questions. And I love that vibe. If you look back in the history of science, it's amazing how often substantial breakthroughs, we talked about genomics already, but there are many examples. To borrow from astronomy, think about, Galileo polishing the lenses, right? How often true discovery comes hand in hand with a new tool or method. It happens all of the time. In our field of neuroscience, patch clamping. So Nair and Sackman, won the Nobel Prize, and that uncovered and created a whole new industry, within 20 years after that discovery. So
you're gonna see how weird
it's
my brain
it's a dream
works.
Come true.
Right before you said NASA, I'm listening to you and I think, and you and I have never met. Usually I meet my podcast guests ahead of time. I've met Chris before. I'm thinking, this guy should be an astronaut. And then he goes, I used to work for NASA. Anyway, so I'm curious to hear what both of you have learned with respect to messaging for the product. What's the takeaway that I'm sure it leads into the repeatable process, but just from speaking to people, what has hit with them?
Talk about a work in progress, right, Chris? I mean, this is on our list of, things we're working on, top of page right now, in fact. What's your answer, Chris?
So I mean, we're at the stage where Brian is. That's exactly where we're working on right now, Chris. So we're trying to figure out what the message that resonates with the early adopters that are going to get their attention to actually engage with us in the way that they're, and finding the right people to be buyers at this stage. So what have we learned? We learned that what we start. Well, go ahead, Chris.
Well, I was going to say, even what was a no? What did you think might work? And someone said, no, that's not it.
Well, I think in Brian's case, we really didn't come up against that. We really didn't know. We had some ideas, and we started this off with Chris. That's where Brian and I started. Just give me a download of what he's hearing and what his thinks, what his thoughts are, and what his hypotheses are, and what his inclinations. That's where we started. And then the very first thing we did, Chris, was start testing that. And that's where we heard the big no. And the big no was not around the messaging so much. And I think, and this is true with genomics, this is true with neuronal signaling. We're so early in the development of the technology and the use of the science that there's this huge gap. And and everybody is looking for answers to fill that gap. So we haven't gotten a no on the messaging. What we haven't figured out quite yet, we're trying to sort out, is what's the message that's going to tap into the problem as it exists today, that's going to compel customers, the market, to respond to us in a way that they want to pull us towards them as a solution to that problem. And that's probably the best way to describe it at a high level. What we're trying to, and so what we've done, or just in the last couple of weeks, is we've internally pulled all of the knowledge we've learned over the last year and come up with what those use cases and the messaging is around those use cases, and what we think the fundamental problem that's driving that use case. And now we're at the stage where we're calling out to existing contacts and pilot sites and customers to kind of test that messaging to see if we're going to hit home. And then the very next step from this, Chris, is we're going to start then redoing all of our marketing outreach to test that messaging, kind of like an A/B type of messaging. And then we're going to take all of that and use it to inform our launch at SFN in October. So we're smack dab in the middle of it. I think the thing that we're learning is that two things. One is there's a problem. People don't know how to use this, and that's like the good news. So they want to learn about it. But the other thing is that it's also the bad news. People don't know how to use this technology yet. So how do we speak into what they don't know to some extent and get their attention? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, there's always a fear of like, how hard is this going to be to do, right? For any science, it's like, oh, it sounds great, but might just be a pain in the ass. But the other thing that jumped out at me is like going back to the beginning of what Brian was talking about, the gap between neuronal signals and behavior, and educating people about what is in that gap or what might be in that gap and why that's too big of a step. So what are the intermediate steps? That's just not so much technology based, but thinking about the problem and getting people to just wake up and go, oh, yeah, you know what? That's an opportunity for all of us to explore.
Yeah, that's a little tricky, Chris. I heard, for a company like Brian's, we have to tap into where the market is and where the problem is in the market that they're ready to respond to. Because, kind of the death, notice when I hear a founder say, we've got a great technology, the market loves it, we just have to educate them.
Yeah.
Okay. That, and any startup and for any company, we don't have the luxury of educating markets. We don't. We have to tap into a problem that they're going to respond to today and are willing to actually pay to solve that problem today. And frankly, that message, that's exactly what we're searching for and finding out trying to figure out what the right messaging is to tap into that right now for diagnostic biochips, for Brian and his team and their technology summer focus. That's exactly the stage we're at. And again, that's pretty early on in developing the repeatable sales process, but that's where we are, and that's a step. And the other thing around that, Chris, is, we kind of know where our market entry point is. Now we're trying to figure out the messaging, but until we figure out the messaging, we can't figure out what the lead generation tactics are that are going to be effective. And we can't figure out what the sales process is until we figure out what the lead generation is to get enough in the pipeline. And we can't then bridge the gap from a happy buyer to a satisfied customer until we have enough customers to bridge that. And those are kind of the stages of the repeatable sales process you have to figure out. And with Brian, we're at this stage. With other companies I'm at, we're at later stages or earlier stages in the process.
That's a great summary of the whole framework right there. All the things you have to know and when you have to know them to get to the next step. So
the other thing I will say, Chris, and then you alluded to this a minute ago, how difficult is this? If you look at statistically what Brian is doing right now, the stage is at this early market entry stage for disruptive technologies is probably the hardest thing to do in business. What I'm doing for Brian is helping him avoid all the mistakes that I've made over my career. So instead of him taking 3 years to figure this out, we can figure it out in 18 months. But for a company like Brian, that's the difference between success and failure if we can avoid those. But the point I'm kind of making, this is still probably one of, if not the hardest thing to do in business, is launching a disruptive technology and figuring and getting your place in the market, establishing your place in the marketplace so you can build a successful business.
fantastic. Brian, do you want to say anything before we wrap up?
I would just, I really appreciate Chris's perspective and summary. I spot on agree with everything he said in the last few minutes here. I guess it strikes me what a funny combination between urgency and patience it is. So we just had a team meeting, this afternoon. We have an unbelievable team, relatively small. There's 8 of us, but incredibly motivated, hardworking people who are invested in the success. And we had this conversation about sort of balancing a sense of urgency with patience, right? And I think sometimes investors tend to hear patience and they think that that's like going slow, or no, there's also urgency. But it's what Chris was talking about, that there's an order, there's a method and an order, which is really what Chris has helped us understand what those steps are, because it is unique to be penetrating a new market. And there's not a lot of books out there. There's some, of course, but there's not a really well-trodden success sort of runway for launching a new technology like this. So I'm happy to have this input.
Oh yeah, it's super important. I mean, I just launched a podcast today about, a lot of good things don't make it because the runway runs out, right? And and it's not the science or something. It's just like you got to do things the right way.
Yep.
And I'll add just a little thing to that, Chris. That's my mission, is to help these technologies that should be in the marketplace, that should be making an impact, actually help with a couple of those that would have failed because we didn't know how to do it, helping companies like Brian be able to do it and be successful. And I gotta say, the thing that gives me chills and gets me excited is, going back to what Brian said at the beginning, this technology has an opportunity to have a huge impact on how we treat Alzheimer's and putting an end to Alzheimer's, or finding a cure to Alzheimer's, or a way to slow it down, or identify it earlier. That's the opportunity we have with all these technologies. So anything we can do to help these things find success in the world. I mean, what a great mission to have, and what, as I said, I had the opportunity to do it in the genomic space, and I get the opportunity to do some of this type of work with Brian. But what a great thing! What a great opportunity, and for what Brian and I are doing today, but also for everybody out there that has a family member with Alzheimer's or Lou Gehrig's disease or epilepsy or whatever it may be, the potential impact we can have.
Yeah. All right. Chris Morrison from Via Veris and Brian Jameson from Diagnostic Biochips. Thanks so much. This was a blast, you guys.
Awesome.
It was
Thank
a
you,
lot of fun,
Chris.
Chris. Thanks.
Hey, if you're still listening, that tells me you enjoyed the podcast. But don't tell me, tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another episode. Okay, you can tell me too. Send an email, chris@lifesciencemarketingradio.com. Bye-bye.